space to discuss a topic on which ignorance too often abounds and the truth too rarely perceived, and that is the most important topic on earth: peace. What kind of a peace do I mean, and what kind of a peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time. I speak of peace because of the new face of war. Total war makes no sense in an age where great powers can maintain large and relatively invulnerable nuclear forces and refuse to surrender without resort to those forces. It makes no sense in an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive force delivered by all the Allied air forces in the Second World War. It makes no sense in an age when the deadly poisons produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of the globe and to generations yet unborn. Today, the expenditure of billions of dollars every year on weapons acquired for the purpose of making sure we never need them is essential to the keeping of peace. But surely the acquisition of such idle stockpiles, which can only destroy and never create, is not the only, much less the most efficient, means of assuring peace. I speak of peace, therefore, as the necessary, rational end of rational men. I realize the pursuit of peace is not as dramatic as the pursuit of war, and frequently the words of the pursuers fall on deaf ears, but we have no more urgent task. Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do. I believe we can help them do it. But I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitudes as individuals and as a nation, for our attitude is as essential as theirs. And every graduate of this school, every thoughtful citizen who despairs of war and wishes to bring peace should begin by looking inward, by examining his own attitude towards the possibilities of peace, towards the Soviet Union, towards the course of the Cold War, and towards freedom and peace here at home. First, examine our attitude towards peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But that is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made. Therefore, they can be solved by man, and man can be as big as he wants. No problem of human destiny is beyond human beings. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the seemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again. I am not referring to the absolute, infinite concept of universal peace and goodwill, of which some fantasies and fanatics dream. I do not deny the value of hopes and dreams, but we merely invite discouragement and incredulity by making that our only and immediate goal. Let us focus instead on a more practical, more attainable peace. based not on a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions, on a series of concrete actions and effective agreements which are in the interests of all concerned. There is no single simple key to this peace, no grand or magic formula to be adopted by one or two powers. Genuine peace must be the product of many nations, the sum of many acts. It must be dynamic, not static, changing to meet the challenge of each new generation. For peace is a process, a way of solving problems. With such a peace, there will still be quarrels and conflicting interests, as there are within families and nations. World peace, like community peace, does not require that each man love his neighbor. It requires only that they live together in mutual tolerance, submitting their disputes to a just and peaceful settlement. And history teaches us that enmities between nations, as between individuals, do not last forever. However fixed our likes and dislikes may seem, the tide of time and events will often bring surprising changes in the relations between nations and neighbors. So let us persevere. Peace need not be impractical, and war need not be inevitable. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. Among the many traits the peoples of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual abhorrence of war. Almost unique among the major world powers, we have never been at war with each other. And no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in the Second World War. At least 20 million lost their lives. Countless millions of homes and families were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the destruction of this country east of Chicago. Today, should total war ever break out again, no matter how, our two countries will be the primary target. It is an ironic but accurate fact that the two strongest powers are the two in the most danger of devastation. All we have built, all we have worked for, would be destroyed in the first 24 hours. And even in the Cold War, which brings burdens and dangers to so many countries, including this nation's closest allies, our two countries bear the heaviest burdens. For we are both devoting massive sums of money to weapons that could be better devoted to combat ignorance, poverty, and disease. We are both caught up in a vicious and dangerous cycle, with suspicion on one side breeding suspicion on the other, and new weapons begetting counter-weapons. In short, both the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies, have a mutually deep interest in a just and genuine peace and in holding the arms race. Agreements to this end are in the interests of the Soviet Union as well as ours, and even the most hostile nations can be relied upon to accept and keep those treaty obligations, and only those treaty obligations, which are in their own interest. So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, At least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Jose Vega, and I will be moderating the Saturday Town Hall. It's a bit of an unorthodox day today, lots of things going on. We opened up with a Kennedy clip because we are 1 week away from the anniversary of that speech that you just heard, the June 10th speech. What kind of peace do we mean? Do I mean a Pax Americana? No. And so, without me having to pontificate here, I'm actually going to bring up my friends who will be presenting for today. We have Renee Segerson and Harley Schlanger. And we are actually going to begin with Harley Schlanger. Excuse my cat was just flying in the back. I'm sorry. I just saw like a black blur fly across. I guess he has the zoomies right now. But anyway, let's turn it over to you, Harley. Go ahead, Harley. Start us off. What do you got for us today?
Well, thank you, Jose. And luckily that wasn't a drone zooming across your room. I think it's very appropriate and important that we started with that clip from the Kennedy speech that's nearly 60 years ago. And we will be holding a conference next Saturday, which will be taking up the broad implications of John F. Kennedy's vision of peace. And what I want to look at is the question of, given that we had such a clear statement of working through diplomatic means for negotiations presented by Kennedy in that speech. And by the way, Nikita Khrushchev, who nearly went to nuclear war with John Kennedy just 8 months before that, said that was the greatest American speech since Franklin Roosevelt. And I'll come back to that in just a couple of moments. But the question emerges, how did we get to the point where today the leading diplomats, the so-called leaders of the entire transatlantic world, instead of working for peace, are working for a permanent war? What happened? And I think the best way to look at that is to contrast what you just saw, and I'll come back to Kennedy, and then I know Renee will have some more remarks later on what I'm about to present now. But what happened is that the U.S. policy was hijacked by a gang of neoconservative liberal Democrats. They call themselves the world of liberal democracy. But I'm going to focus on one which Renee will be talking about more later, which shows the absolute difference of approach between what you just heard from John Kennedy, who was president, and from what we've seen in the last 60 years since his death. And the best way to look at that, in my thinking, is to look at the character and activity of one Henry A. Kissinger, who just turned 100 years old last week, to much acclaim, and people from all nations in the West talking about the importance of Kissinger, venerating him, and so on. But what was Kissinger really? And I want to look at that, then come back to Kennedy to give you a clear sense of what was lost with that assassination and then the cover-up. Lyndon LaRouche defined Henry Kissinger as a British agent. Many people were saying, who didn't like him, well, they thought he was a Soviet agent. But if you look at the policies that he carried out, and you can look in his own words, he was functioning as an agent of influence of the City of London and the broader world of the British Empire. Now, let me give you his own words on this from a speech that Lyndon LaRouche referred back to many, many times that Kissinger gave at Chatham House on May 11th, 1982. Now, Chatham House is the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It's the center of British intelligence. And here's what Kissinger said in that speech. And can I get the post for that? Kissinger said, "Britain and America have never ceased to play a role in each other's history." Now that's kind of a rich interpretation, given that American history was made as a nation by rebelling against British colonialism. But he goes on to say, on the whole, it has been a productive and creative relationship, perhaps one of the most durable in the history of nations. In the last 200 years, we have approached each other sometimes warily and dealt with foreign affairs often from different perspectives. Still, on balance, the relationship has been of considerable benefit to world peace. A highly dubious statement there. Let's go to the next one. He went on to say, Britain has rarely proclaimed moral absolutes or rested her faith in the ultimate efficacy of technology. Philosophically, she remains Hobbesian. She expects the worst and is rarely disappointed. In moral matters, Britain has traditionally practiced a convenient form of ethical egoism, believing that what was good for Britain was best for the rest. Well, that's a mild statement. The idea of the British Empire dominating the world was what was the British view, and that nothing can be allowed to get in the way. And the Hobbesian philosophical reference is quite significant, because Hobbes believed that all men were beasts, and that the world would be a war of each against all unless a forceful power from above comes in and takes control. And that was the attitude of the British Empire. Now, Kissinger may not have been a fully committed Hobbesian, although he was a Hobbesian when it came to this idea of what is the nature of man, that men are beasts and have to be restrained or controlled. But the other British tradition that's part of this is the Lockean tradition, which still starts from the same axiom, that men are animals, that human beings have to have some form of restraint to keep from killing each other. Hobbes said you need a leviathan, a power. Locke said you need contracts and agreements. But the contracts that Locke meant were very similar to what we see from the B team running U.S. foreign policy called the rules-based order. So let's go back to Kissinger's words from this Chatham House speech in 1982. The next slide, please. He admitted in this speech, in my negotiations over Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe and was at the time in the midst of a anti-colonial revolution, he said, in those negotiations, I worked from a British draft with British spelling. The practice of collaboration thrives to our day, with occasional ups and downs, but even in the Falklands crisis, an inevitable return to the main theme of the relationship. And I'll get to the Falklands crisis in a moment. And the final part from his presentation there, he said, in my White House incarnation, I kept the British Foreign Office better informed and more closely engaged than I did the American State Department. Now think about that. Think about these comments from Henry Kissinger. He's basically saying that the U.S. only functions effectively in a special relationship. Earlier in that speech, he said the periods of close Anglo-American special relationship, the object of nostalgia today, were also the times of mutual exasperation. But the special relationship for Kissinger was the key to foreign policy. Now, why is 1982 so important, the year that he gave this speech? Well, this was the year when the awareness of Lyndon LaRouche's opposition to Kissinger in the tradition of John F. Kennedy became one of the central battlegrounds in American politics. Kissinger was aware of LaRouche from well before that. Just one example, Lyndon LaRouche testified before the committee that was considering whether to accept Nelson Rockefeller for appointment as vice president to Gerald Ford after Nixon had been run out of the office and his vice president, Spiro Agnew, had been forced to resign. So LaRouche testified against Kissinger's controller, or I should say his patron, Nelson Rockefeller. Furthermore, we had been, as a growing movement, on U.S. campuses focused heavily on Kissinger's role in the genocide that was occurring in Vietnam and Cambodia, for no reason other than maintaining an empire. At that time, it was no longer the French Empire, but it was a kind of Anglo-American imperium that the United States was moving into run. This is after 1966-67, after the assassination of Kennedy. So Kissinger would have been well aware of what Lyndon LaRouche thought about his outlook. But in 1982 in particular, actually before that, there was one other point of direct opposition between LaRouche and Kissinger, and that was on the idea of Malthusian policy. The National Security Study Memo 200, which was a blueprint for depopulation targeting 13 developing sector nations, arguing that their growth was a threat to the national security of the United States, that their economic development would take resources needed by the United States and our allies, and therefore U.S. policy should be to use food as a weapon, among other means, of controlling population in these Southern Hemisphere nations. LaRouche countered that with his International Development Bank proposal. With our ceaseless efforts to expose the International Monetary Fund as a deadly collection agency for the international banks. In 1982, Lyndon LaRouche met with Mexico's President Jose López Portillo, and shortly after that, in August of '82, drafted a document, Operation Juarez, which laid out a strategy for the development of Southern Hemisphere countries, including the idea of dealing with the debt crisis with the debt bomb. That is, the threat to cancel debt if there's not an effort to provide for development and debt renegotiation, moratoria, and so on. This would have blown up the whole Western control of the banking system at that point. And this was something that was very much clear in Kissinger's mind. Also, it was that year, in April, that the British invaded Argentina. The Argentines had taken back what the British call the Falklands Islands, and what the Argentines correctly call the Malvinas. And the British sent the Royal Navy and troops all across the ocean to the Southern Hemisphere to wage a war to take back what they thought was their property. Helping the British on that was Alexander Haig, who was working at the time in the Reagan administration. Haig had been a deputy of Kissinger when Kissinger was Secretary of State. And so you had the Kissinger networks, as Kissinger mentioned, working directly with the British on this war to reimpose colonialism on the Malvinas Islands. Finally, in 1982, there were two other points. It became known to some people that Lyndon LaRouche was working with the Reagan administration on what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And this led to an exchange of two letters from Kissinger to Judge William Webster, who was the head of the FBI. The first one thanking Webster for a heads up on what LaRouche was doing. The second one was Kissinger calling for an investigation of LaRouche as a Soviet agent of influence. And this played a leading role in setting up the Get LaRouche Task Force. Now, so this brings up the question of what was it that Kissinger was deploying against? Now, Kennedy, as I mentioned, came from the FDR tradition. But also, this was a tradition that was very prevalent in politicians in both parties in the post-war period. That is, while there was an effort to make the United States the leader of the Cold War, that is, challenging or containing the Soviet Union, building up forces which included NATO, even Eisenhower recognized that this was a dangerous proposition. He recognized it in 1956 when the British, the French, and the Israelis invaded Egypt with the Suez Crisis, and Eisenhower told them to get the hell out. Again, on the eve of Kennedy's inauguration, Eisenhower gave his famous speech about warning about the overt influence of the military-industrial complex. And Kennedy consulted on a couple of occasions with Eisenhower. Now, some people say, well, but Kennedy was a Cold Warrior, that he still had these instincts. And they point to his willingness to possibly go to war over Cuba. Well, the fact is, not only did Kennedy not go to war over Cuba, but he avoided a possible nuclear war and used that incident, the Cuban Missile Crisis, as the basis for what we might call a détente policy with the Soviet Union. But even before that, I just want to give you an example, a clear example of the difference between Kennedy and Kissinger when it came to the Global South. In April 1954, in a Senate speech, John Kennedy spoke about the question of would the U.S. take up the role of the French in maintaining colonialism in Vietnam. And Kennedy said this on the Senate floor: "No amount of American military assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere, a, quote, enemy of the people, unquote, which rather has the sympathy and covert support of the people." In other words, that the argument that we have to defend Vietnam from its own people, that is the Ho Chi Minh networks, Kennedy said that's a fraud and we shouldn't get involved in that. This was long before the Vietnam War. And then again in 1959, he became chair of the Africa Subcommittee of the Senate. And he made this statement, quote, "Call it nationalism, call it anti-colonialism, call it what you will, Africa is going through a revolution. The word is out and spreading like wildfire in nearly 1,000 languages and dialects, that it is no longer necessary to remain forever poor or in bondage." And he said we should have sympathy with the independence movement, programs of economic and educational assistance as the goal of American policy for a strong Africa. Now, contrast that to Henry Kissinger's view of the Global South. And those of you who live in the Global South, take note of this. In 1969, when he was working for Nixon as a national security advisor, he said that he had no interest in developments in the southern hemisphere from the Pyrenees on down. Nothing important can come from the south. The axis of history starts in Moscow, goes to Bonn, crosses over to Washington, and then to Tokyo. What happens in the south, Kissinger said, is of no importance, unquote. So contrast that with what you heard from Kennedy in somewhat early statements against colonialism. Now then let's go ahead to the Cuban crisis. 1961, Kennedy's inaugurated, and immediately he's told the U.S. has a plan to invade Cuba. But to make it seem as though it's not the U.S., we've organized Cubans to be the expeditionary force to land on the island. And Kennedy was told they will probably win, they'll defeat the Cuban government, which is Castro, which is unpopular, and then we'll be able to liberate the island from the Castro. Now, Kennedy himself told his friends he was skeptical that this could work, but he knew that the people who were proposing it had in mind that once the expeditionary force landed and was being routed, that the U.S. would come in with air power and troops to physically overthrow Castro. Now, when the Bay of Pigs was launched, 3 months after Kennedy's inauguration, the opposite of what was projected by the Warhawks happened. They lost. The population and the army of Cuba rose up and defeated them. And the military leaders came to Kennedy and said, now you've got to deploy the U.S. Army to go in and do the job to get rid of Castro. And Kennedy refused. And he was told, but if you don't do this, you will look weak in the face of communism. We have these Cuban emigres in Florida. They'll be angry. There'll be repercussions. And Kennedy said, we're not going to go in with U.S. forces into Cuba. Now, a year later, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, Kennedy was told, you cannot be weak, you have to be tough, strong, we have to do something to deal with the deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba. Kennedy first wanted to confirm that there were Soviet missiles being put in, and they found out that there were. And then Kennedy immediately addressed the nation and told the population that we're going to have an embargo, a naval embargo, to stop more ships from getting into Cuba, and sent a strongly worded message to the Soviet Union. But at the same time, Kennedy launched a back channel through his brother, Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General, and the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Anatoly Dobrynin. And they worked out a deal. But it was 10, 12, 14 days of incredible tension. Would there be a war that could become a nuclear war at any minute? And both Kennedy and Khrushchev came to the recognition that the other had the same problem that he had. That is, that Kennedy made it known to the Russians that there were war hawks that wanted to go to war and thought Kennedy was a wimp, was a coward for not doing it. And Khrushchev conveyed he had the same problem. And what occurred was exactly what is behind this idea of the principle of Westphalia, recognizing the interests of the other, putting yourself in the position of the other and deciding what's the right thing to do. And in this case, both Kennedy and Khrushchev realized they had to come up with a deal. And the deal ultimately was that the Soviets would remove their missiles, and the U.S. would do a quid pro quo, remove Jupiter missiles we had in Turkey, but would do it a few months later and without making any connection to the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. Khrushchev agreed to that. And this began a back channel that was moving toward something that was extremely important. And it's in this context that you see the June 10th speech of 1963 given by Kennedy when he had been under enormous pressure from his advisors to do something more dramatic to confront the Soviet Union. Now, it was in this speech, and you just heard it, I won't go through the whole thing, but there are a couple of points that I think have to be reiterated and can't be heard often enough to realize that there once was an American president who spoke this way. And when he was speaking, he wasn't just speaking to the graduates at American University or the American people. He knew he was speaking to the Russian people. And he said, what kind of peace do I mean? What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war. In other words, an exact opposite to what the United States policy is with the proxy war in Ukraine today. He went on to say, not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I'm talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace for all time. And he went on then to express openly the common aims, that we have something in common in spite of our differences, and it's those common aims which should bring us together. And he said, if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet, we all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's future, and we are all mortal. Now, I want to give you a quote from Lyndon LaRouche to give you a sense of his view of what we lost from the assassination of Kennedy, the cover-up, and then the silence, the official silence for the last 60 years that was supposed to be broken with the release of documents. And repeatedly that was postponed, most recently by President Trump at the end of his term. What LaRouche said about the assassination of John F. Kennedy is that it was, quote, a defining moment for the United States, which launched the long spiral downward. It was destabilizing, particularly with the cover-up. The combination of the assassination with the cover-up did destabilize the U.S., the institution of the government of the United States, and destroyed the presidency as an efficient institution of government. Now, this is what we're dealing with today. We have a president who is barely able to stand on his own 2 feet, who's advised by people who are essentially working on behalf of global cartels run by oligarchs with the commitment to maintain what they call a rules-based order, which has nothing to do with the benefit for people of the world or for people of the United States or Europe. In fact, we're as much the victims in some ways as the people in the global South. Our economies are being destroyed. Our physical economies are being looted. Under the Green New Deal, the moves toward a global central bank dictatorship, the loss of sovereignty, the ability of all people for self-government is being destroyed by those who follow in the legacy of Henry A. Kissinger. Instead, we must win the United States population back to the legacy of John F. Kennedy. And that's what our mission is, and that's what we intend to do with the events on June 10th and in the period leading up to that, to make people aware that we once had a president who could speak eloquently about this hope for the future and the difference between man and the beast. So those are my comments for now.
Okay. Thank you, Harley. All right. Renee, it's your turn. Take it over. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you just fine.
And can I just ask you a question, since we didn't have a chance because of this important meeting you were at to coordinate before? Do you have access to that audio file that I sent to you so that we can play the 3 minutes in? Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yes, I do know what you're referring to. Are you saying you want to play the first 3 minutes, or you want me to go to?
No, after in 3 minutes in, but I don't want you to do it right away. I'll tell you when, but I wanted to make sure now so that it comes in the right spirit.
So you want me to go to? So you want me to fast forward to 3 minutes, right?
You got it, sir.
Okay.
You got it.
Go for it. You let me know. I'll have it ready when you want it.
Okay, thank you. Now, I want to do that because it gives us a chance to hear a sigh from the soul of Lyndon LaRouche, acted out by a qualified reciter, to convey what it meant for Lyndon LaRouche to reflect on the personality and existence of Henry Kissinger. And I think it creates a very good mood to hear that. Last week was John Kennedy's birthday, actually. I believe it was right there on Memorial Day, and we found people all over the country who were very excited when the media did not bother to mention that Memorial Day was his birthday. When we told them that it was his birthday and that that's why we needed to talk to them. And there was tremendous excitement about that. But about 48 hours before, it was Henry Kissinger's 100th birthday. And one of the most atrocious examples of lauding him and as Harley was saying, this veneration that was shown around the world for his alleged great mental capabilities, was that the London Economist, the headquarters for British intelligence and the British Empire of drug trafficking and terrorism around the world, did an 8-hour interview with Mr. HAK, Mr. Henry Kissinger, on the strategic situation. An 8-hour interview. Can you imagine such a thing? I mean, everybody was impressed that he was able to keep himself on the subject, and at 100 years old was actually very sharply. He's so focused on evil, he has no problem in being very precise in what he had to say. But I think they edited a lot of it, actually. But there were reasons this interview was done. And I took the time, not 8 hours, I took the time to read it because I knew other people, when they heard it, that weren't going to want to read it, and did a summary of it. And I'm going to provide it to you. It will take about 3 minutes to tell you what he had to say. And then I'm going to play you this 3-minute excerpt of Mr. LaRouche talking about what he went through, focusing on the question of Henry Kissinger, because which he had to do because Kissinger was a leader in the fight to try to destroy his political career and to unleash havoc against those in the Reagan administration who were interested in LaRouche's ideas. But also that it is the case that today it is becoming much more visible how the power of the oligarchy is wielded. A lot is coming out because of the Ukraine war, about how these background operations operate. And there's been decades where people have been examining this and studying it. And there's really no reason to tolerate any longer the game that goes on between these financial interests, as Harley was saying, these international cartels and banks, and their interweaving activities with the intelligence services, but that the only way to stop it is to create an international political movement, what Helga LaRouche has called a new kind of peace movement, to create a movement of ordinary people who are exerting their inalienable right to solve the problems of mankind and to impose from the outside the kind of discipline and discipline policies in nations around the world in concert with each other, reflecting this principle of the benefit of the other, that the only way to stop that is for huge numbers, we're talking about thousands of people getting involved with this and opening their eyes and their souls, to the responsibility that they have to take as citizens in order to get this done. And it's basically been a fear factor and something that Mr. LaRouche will address in the when he addresses the solution, what has held people back from doing what he did, which is to put yourself on the front lines and say, we're going to solve this problem. So I'm going to go through what Kissinger had to say, then Mr. LaRouche's reaction, and then the solution. Now, what Kissinger did in this absurd 8-hour interview is he made basically 3 points, and he was dragged out to make these 3 points because there is an hysterical denial in the ranks of the establishment, in the think tank, political intelligence propaganda of ranks, an hysterical denial that their system is falling apart and that these countries of the South, the countries of the countries with the largest populations in the world, what the Russian foreign minister calls the new a global majority, which means India, China, Russia, Indonesia, et cetera, the Middle Eastern countries that are signing on, they represent more than half of the human population, that they are moving towards solution concepts that have been around for a long time, for the solution concepts that we've been fighting for half a century. And they're now moving to implement those solutions. And there's hysterical denial among the people around Kissinger and company that the old system is so decrepit and crumbling at the seams that in fact we may have reached the era in which it's possible to make a beautiful transition out of the hell that threatens this planet and that is going on day by day, typified by the drone attacks that are going on in Moscow, let alone the patterns of starvation that are continuing to spread around the world. That these problems, we've now reached the point where solutions really are possible. They don't want you to understand that. And I hope that hearing what you had to say and what Mr. LaRouche has to say about the solution, that people will drop the bad habit of talking about our problem as being something called the deep state. I think we should ban that from our vocabulary, the deep state. It's not deep. It's very shallow and it's very visible. but you have to do some work to understand why it still exists. It's existed for a long time, why it still exists, and what we must do in order to eradicate it. What Kissinger said in his interview, his hours of interview, was, number one, that the most important strategic relationship on the planet Earth is between the United States and China. That is true. That happens to be true. That as bad as that relationship is right now, it can be modified. It could be pushed in a different direction. Not the direct. He has an idea of what direction to push it in. It's not what we're talking about, but that it can be modified. It's not fixed, and that the ability of the United States and China to, in some way, the word that's going around right now is de-risking. It's a virtually meaningless term, but that there is a way of coordinating that will give the transatlantic financial elites more of a lifeline to continue what they're doing and to postpone the great crisis that could bring them down, or postpone the great crisis they're hoping will bring the other guys down. So he says the U.S.-China relationship is the most important, and that is absolutely true. What he builds out of that then is he then says the war that is going on with Ukraine is not going to stop. Peace negotiations are not going to work. Kissinger had earlier said that he didn't think Ukraine should be allowed into NATO. He's now changed that policy. He's calling for Ukraine to be brought into NATO. But he also is absolutely insistent that this is going to be a replay of your typical 19th century endless imperial war, a showdown between different national interests, and that Russia and Ukraine will be duking it out, fighting it out, and killing each other on and again, maybe even for decades. This is what he says. Now, he's trying to modify the relationship with China at the same time that he is saying that China's ally is going to be in an endless war. He denies hysterically that China's ally, in this case I'm talking about Russia, which is a friend of China's. It's for years now, there's been a complete transformation in the China-Russia relationship. And Russia is now and China are in a kind of alliance around these new policies. Kissinger cynically taking advantage of his prestigious position as an authority on China, as somebody that even the Chinese media pays a lot of attention to. He says, "Oh, I go to China all the time, and let me tell you, the Chinese have nothing but hatred and contempt for the Russians. They were that way when I was with Nixon back in 1970. They're still like that. They have no respect for the Russians." This is a total and complete lie. And so those are the 3 points. The China-U.S. relationship is the most important. The war is going to go on forever, and the Chinese actually hate the Russians, so don't worry about it. It's not going to interfere with our ability to manipulate some kind of new arrangement with China. So it's a pretty hysterical interview, though delivered in a very calm tone. Why was this published, this silly thing? Well, within hours of it being published, there were think tankers around the world who started adjusting their public statements and their assessments to coincide with Kissinger, because he has that kind. People like John Mearsheimer from Chicago University, for example, because he has that kind of stature, but also because you have a situation where the nature of this establishment that we're fighting, of this relic, this imperial system that we're all wanting to see swept out of history, there is, despite the impression they like to give people, they really don't get along with each other. They hate each other. They fight with each other all the time, and they have lots of contradictions and hate and disagreements and distrust of each other. And as has been noticed in some of the discussions we've held in our public events, it's been emphasized many times by the historian Cliff Kirikoff, who's a former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and has a lot of government experience, that that one of the ways the establishment works is that when things start getting really ragged on the edges and everybody's fighting with everybody else, what they do is they move in to create consensus. And that's what Kissinger is being used for, to even out the disagreements and to create a consensus. And, this is just the ridiculous way that these things work. It doesn't mean it's just worked for a long time, because people snap to, and they do actually. The people in the ranks of the different institutions, particularly the think tanks, the media, let alone the intelligence agencies and so forth, they do line up when the word goes out. This is what you're supposed to believe. So what we have. So what we need to look at now in that regard is what has been Lyndon LaRouche's role in taking this on historically, which made him so hated by Kissinger. We used to in the 1980s, we used to make tons of phone calls to people around the United States, thousands and thousands and millions of phone calls, where we would start the discussion out by saying, "I'm calling you from the office of Lyndon LaRouche, the man that Henry Kissinger hates the most." And people would immediately respond, "I've got to hear from you. I'm really interested in what you have to say." So, as a matter of fact, Lynn was quite proud of that designation. One of the items that I have sitting on my desk in front of me right here is an obituary that was published by the New York Times, which was part of the attack brigade against Mr. LaRouche's criticisms of Kissinger, Mr. LaRouche's policies throughout his life. This is it's an obituary of Henry Kissinger's banker, John Train, who was known to be the head of a small investment company on Wall Street that in particular handled the funds of some of the richest people in the New York area. And Henry Kissinger was one of them. And Train, who was also known for having an intelligence background, where he worked with the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the CIA, and was a journalist, and after World War II, who was deeply involved with all kinds of shenanigans, and ended up raising a lot of money to start the Afghanistan war against Russia. That Mr. Train, even after he passed away, his secretary made a point of putting in his New York Times obituary what he thought, that he believed that he was concerned, and passed out the rumor, which he invented, that Lyndon LaRouche was a possible Soviet agent, and that in a phone interview, this woman, Sarah Perkins, who was his secretary, admitted what we made public about John Train, which is that he's the person who organized and paid for a committee to be pulled together to launch huge attacks in the media and investigations against LaRouche, starting in 1980, very heavily in 1983 after Reagan announced the SDI, but it was building up before then with people like Roy Godson and all kinds of other, who was an aide to Kissinger and stuff like that, where they would meet in Train's office, and they would actually plan out journalistic and other kinds of attacks on Lyndon LaRouche, and she admitted that Train financed this. This is in his official obituary, which is really shows you how incensed these people are about what we've been doing, and why to this day you see the kinds of attacks against Mrs. LaRouche, for example, coming out of American financed Ukraine sources, because this has been going on for a long time, and it doesn't matter whether these rumor mills are generated in Kiev, whether they're generated in Washington, D.C. It's an interrelated network of storytellers who are working together in order to create this kind of environment. I mean, I'm bringing that up because another attack just came out against Mrs. LaRouche in the Ukraine intelligence apparatus called the CCD, the Committee on Countering quote unquote countering disinformation, where they've put out another kind of threat against her. Now, so back all the way in 1981, Mr. LaRouche took a deep breath, as you're going to hear in now this audio tape that you will be given access to. Mr. LaRouche took a deep breath and said, "Well, I've got to deal with this question of Henry Kissinger." So, Jose, why don't you play that now?
Okay, so let's try this here just to make sure. So 3 minutes in, right?
Right. It should be silent.
Let's see. I'll put it here.
Let's see what happens.
Put the audio on. Let's see. Let's hear. We're going to hear it first.
To discover
That's my
what I mean
voice.
by dimensionalities.
That's the end of my introduction. Okay, you're fine.
Okay, so from right there, right? And then for how long?
I would say until it's about another 3 minutes. I would say it's until he says, "I'll tell you when to stop."
Perfect. All right, so I'll keep your audio line open.
Thank
so
you.
I'm going to put up a picture of Lynn, and we're going to go to the audio.
So here is the recitation.
How the Classics Were Lost, A Personal Reminiscence by Lyndon H. LaRouche, Jr. Published in The Campaigner Magazine, Volume 14, Number 7, October 1981. Read by John Sigerson, May 17th, 2023. Soon, unless William Kunstler's cronies carry out their threat to assassinate me, I shall be 59, and then 60. My maternal grandfather was born in 1862, and one of my great-grandfathers, whom I knew slightly back in the 1920s, was born about 1830. My great-grandfather's father was a legend, whose principal doings were first-hand gossip, fresh as yesterday, at the dinner table of his grandchildren. He was a contemporary in age of Abraham Lincoln. There are certain compensations for approaching 60 years of age. I have been most privileged. My junior, the notorious Henry A. Kissinger, has traveled more than I, but he has had to suffer the misfortune of his own company. There are few things I can imagine more wretched than to be condemned to be Henry Kissinger. How unutterably miserable that poor creature must be. When I think of Henry Kissinger, I appreciate how wonderfully privileged I have been. Let us think of more pleasant subjects than that unhappy nebbish, Henry Kissinger. Let us think back to my schoolmates. For example, those of public school days back in Lynn, Massachusetts, or university acquaintances, such as the Washington Star editor Murray Gart. Let us think back to my companions returning from the China-Burma-India theater at the end of the war. How bright were the convictions, the shiny, homeward-turning determination to do something for the world historical good once we all returned to civilized life. We had learned our lesson, not to let the world sneak up on us the way it had caught us unawares with the Great Depression and then the war. What damned fools! If Henry were not such an obnoxious, traveling social disease, I could simply pity the poor creature that he is, like the bums who used to stab desperately for my windshield with a foul rag whenever I was trapped for a moment by that red light at the end of the Bowery. I would rather not have to think about poor creatures like Henry. Poor Henry. He had no choice but to be born, and we must suppose some circumstance made him what he became. Damned circumstances that transform newborn schmageggies like Henry into such things as Henry became. Fritz Kramer, the man who claims to have invented Henry Kissinger, was a circumstance. So was the Frankfurt BHF Bank, linked to the fascist P2 Lodge, which the head of the Paris Grand Orient Freemasonic Lodge insisted and documented to be a Rockefeller trilateral operation. The Netherlands end of the Bilderbergers, the mother of the trilateral, is crawling with certified wartime Nazis. One wonders about the circumstance of Henry mixing with all those former Italian and Dutch Nazis. I once said, "To the devil with Kissinger." But the devil called me up, rebuking me for that. The devil said, "Do you really hate me that much?" Let us force ourselves to forget Henry. Back to less unpleasant memories. What galls me today remembering the school chums? Take Murray Gart, for one. Bright, but shallow. He chose the right career in journalism where his brightness could carry him to the top, and in which professional shallowness is at a premium. Likeable, but not to be taken seriously. Did you ever drink a sip from a bottle of cheap, fizzed-out, warm orange soda? As cheap as they used to make the stuff back during the days of the Great Depression? Maybe Rockefeller mistook Henry for a pre-Columbian relic. That might explain something. It is really bad-tasting stuff. I mean, the soda. That's what I resent in memory of school chums and those lying fellow veterans who promised to take life seriously. What name do we put to that cathexis of bad-tasting, warm, fizzed-out, cheap orange soda? One word will do. Littleness. What breaks my heart when I remember most of them is that awful sense of their spiritual littleness. Get your kicks. Fake it. Become a success. Be popular. Be a regular guy. You younger folks might not remember the 1930s connotations of be popular or regular guy. The connotations are disgusting, especially when you look back to the days before and just after the war. I don't know any who, to my knowledge, turned out as badly as Henry did, but they all disappointed me badly.
That's it.
The
Jose.
1930s and 1940s were...
Okay. He develops this further, and it's the whole discussion on littleness and shallowness and not wanting to rise to allow the agony of what people had lived through to affect what kind of priorities they were going to set in their life. That failure within the population at large is the source of the power of the oligarchy. And this is why in the recent period, Dennis Speed, who's normally the host of this event, has really been fighting with everybody to read a 2000 article, an article that Lynn wrote in year 2000 called Politics as Art, which picks up on where this thought process began. He was constantly addressing this problem, but this was a particularly profound and penetrating moment in 1981 when Lynn composed that after our having successfully defeated George Bush Sr. in the 1980 election grab that he tried to take away from Reagan. But the question is, what are we going to do with the new Reagan administration? And could we do it? And Lynn had to come face to face with his own sighing recognition that this Kissinger question was going to be a big problem. So let me say just a couple of other things about Henry Kissinger, and then a couple of other things quickly about the solution. You heard the name Fritz Kramer go by, just to make sure that this is key. I hope Harley may remember more about him, could say a few things about him. But the story of Kissinger's recruitment to this role, the man who embodies the way that this interactive process of the intelligence communities works and has for centuries. The fellow who identified Kissinger as a very likely choice for the establishment to build up was a U.S. Army counterintelligence officer in 1943, a point where it was obviously that eventually, soon, within foreseeable future, that the Nazis were going to lose the war. He was in charge there at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, and he brought Kissinger. He met Kissinger there, and he said, "You're the kind of guy that we need," and took him to the European Command Intelligence School at Oberammergau in West Germany. In the western part of Germany. It wasn't called West Germany then, but anyway, in the western part of Germany, which was dominated by a project run by British intelligence called the Wilton Park Program. Kissinger was brought in, and the people running it were all, including Kramer himself, were graduates and had fellowships with Balliol College at Oxford University in London. They were all part of British intelligence. So Kissinger was brought into this mixture, and within a few years, they persuaded him to go to Harvard University and to work with the notorious William Yandell Elliott, who was the madman, the Confederate cultish loony, who was churning out ideologues for a revival of for a cementing of an Anglo-American culture and era of domination of the world. So you have this period from 1943 going into the 1950s, the same period that Harley was just talking about, that John Kennedy was waking up to the fact that we could develop the third world, that we could develop, in fact, and in which the famous conference occurred in 1955, the Bandung Conference, where India and China and Indonesia and dozens of nations from around the world came together and said, World War II is over, the Nazis have been defeated, now's the time to eliminate poverty, and began an international mobilization where they said, we're not going to take sides in the Cold War. We're not going to join either with Russia, we're not going to join with the United States, we're going to fight with both sides to end colonialism. And it was this Kissinger crowd who targeted that Bandung meeting and said, no, you are going to be crushed. You are not going to eliminate colonialism. And the order that we're going to create is going to force the issue that a lot of you are going to end up taking sides and are going to, take sides with the British against Russia and so on and so forth. So Kennedy was caught in the middle of this, and it's worth mentioning. I mean, it's mentioned before, but right before Kennedy was inaugurated, like immediately before, one of the people that he had his eyes on to work with in the third world, namely Congo President Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated by the intelligence agencies. And this is really where the assassination spree that broke out in the 1960s began. This group was also very heavily targeted. Sukarno of Indonesia was targeted, and what should have been solved in the 1950s, between 1943, when it was obvious the Nazis were going to lose, and 1955, this is what should have been on the agenda, with a greatly expanded and slightly different configured Marshall Plan. Germany could have become a factory for export to the third world for economic development. That was banned. And what you're looking at with Kissinger is the crowd that ordered that no such progress of human civilization will occur. And the beauty of listening to Kennedy's speech today is that it's a wonderful example of what is called temporal eternity, because even though that speech, June 10th, 1963, was given in 1963, it could have been given yesterday. It should have been given yesterday by an American president. And that mission is still there. That mission is the same. Now, just to cut more to the chase, in Lynn's statement that John read, that he recited so that you could hear his soul in what he was saying. he is creating a fugue between two subjects. One of them is the evil of Henry Kissinger. Even the devil couldn't stand him. But then there's another fugal subject, which is the littleness and the shallowness of the people. And by addressing the cause of that, which is this desire to be popular, this desire to resonate, what he called the popular classics, which was a term that Lynn absolutely despised, popular classics, as opposed to what the citizen really needs, which is an education in the methods of composition of the classical principle, where you bring together in the classical principle, which made this nation possible, which this nation is actually a reflection of in the way that it was founded, the way the Constitution was written, that this nation was based on a different outlook, which is that economics and science and literacy and ideas are universal, belong to all mankind, and are accessible to all human beings by the nature of the way God created the universe. And I just want to conclude my remarks by pointing out that in the article that Dennis is really urging people to read, and we will make this other article from 1981 also available, but in the article that Dennis has been urging people to read, called Politics is Art, there's a footnote right on the first page, referencing that just as this article was going to print, Pope John Paul II had announced the declaration that a great man in English-speaking culture, you may be familiar with the name, which is Sir Thomas More, had just been made a patron saint by the Vatican, and specifically was named the patron of statesmen and politicians. And this is very important that this is a footnote in this article, is Politics is Art, because Thomas More was the person who was executed by Henry VIII, who also cut off the heads of 8 of his wives and was a mass murderer. And it was that juncture in the British developments, which was a rejection of the great accomplishments of the Renaissance and a turn towards the bestiality that we face today, that Kissinger and his friends represent, which characterizes the British Empire to this day. And Thomas More was the person who not only stood against it, but who launched, despite the fact that he was under so much attack, he actually launched the theatrical movement around Marlowe and Shakespeare to get people in England to fight against this through the development of classical theater. The same kind of thing that happened in the classical Greek period, that great theater based on classical principles of composition was used to elevate the population. And Thomas More was key in that, in the fact that he actually wrote a play about the murders that were committed by Richard III. You can all of this stuff is available on the internet. You can find out all about it. It's really a rather remarkable, beautiful story. But he wrote the first play about Richard III, which Shakespeare then rewrote, and he and Marlowe were the ones who really launched the great theater in England that became the source of so much revolutionary counteroffensive against the nightmares that were created. The kind of world that Henry Kissinger wants to create, that he and Fritz Kramer and William Mandel Elliott were talking about then and that they're talking about now, of constant war, that is the devilish view of mankind, the Hobbesian view, as he said, of mankind, which is that it's inevitable that people cannot get along with each other, they will fight to the last man because they really don't care how many people survive. And that view of civilization, which was very predominant in the 19th century, which Henry Kissinger thinks he's still living in, that's got to end. And people have to step up to the plate and educate themselves in the way that Lynn is talking about, so that we're not little people anymore, but but we make government work. And that's the point of these discussions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Renee. I brought back Harley. We do have another person who will be joining us for the Q&A. But before I bring them in, I just wanted to open up the discussion. Harley, if you had any reactions or responses to what Renee presented, and also vice versa, Renee, if you had any reactions to what Harley said.
Well, thank you, Renee, for that view of Henry Kissinger. It does tend to turn your stomach to think about how these people work together. But as long as we're mentioning some articles, I think you probably used this one in the EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, September 22nd, 1995. And you can find this at larouchepub.com. There's an article called Profile Sir Henry Kissinger, a British Agent Since His Youth, which gives a lot of the background, including of Fritz Kramer and, importantly, William Yandell Elliott. Elliott, from the 30s onward, was working very closely with John Wheeler Bennett, who was the director of intelligence at Chatham House. So it's no coincidence that Kissinger goes to Chatham House in 1982 to reaffirm the special relationship and make it clear that the State Department, the policy elites of the United States will remain loyal to this tradition. And, we get a lot on this all the time where people say, well, how can you talk about the British Empire? It's been gone for a long time. It died in World War II. This is where what Renee was just discussing is so important. The war of culture between the bestial tradition that goes back to Aristotle, that goes back to people such as the people we're talking about, the Fritz Kramers, the Fabian Society in Britain, and so on, that these are the ones who orient their lives toward controlling the minds of the population. And how? By educating them? No, by uneducating them, by essentially using this principle of littleness. And just one final point on this. When Lynn writes about tragedy, what he does is attack this idea that most people have, that a tragic play is about the tragic hero who doesn't rise to the occasion. And it's true, there are a lot of people who don't rise to the occasion, but what Lynn writes about is that it's actually the tragedy of the whole society, as in the case of Hamlet. The comment, there's not something rotten in Denmark. This idea of littleness, of popular opinion. This is how identity politics works. The idea that you can't control anything, that ideas don't work, so you've got to find some smaller affinity, whether it's sexual identity, religion, tribe, family, something that you have in common with at least one other person that you can be manipulated around so you don't fight the big fights. And that's why it's so significant that Kissinger is then brought out again to help reach this consensus that the real issue is preparing for the war with China. And you mentioned Mearsheimer. A lot of people like Mearsheimer because he's a critic of the Ukraine war. He's a critic of NATO. But what's his ultimate point? His point is we're missing the big battle. The big battle is the one to come with China. And if you look at the people who are justifying the Ukraine war against Russia, NATO's war against Russia and Ukraine, they're the same people who are prepared to go to war against China, because their enemy is not Russia or China, it's humanity. And that's what our fight is, and that's why it's so beautiful to see a president like Kennedy, who had lots of flaws. We're not saying he was the greatest person in world history, but who was able to rise to an occasion above the people around him, elevate the people around him, to give speeches like that one, or the one at Rice University where he talked about we're going to go to the moon and come back safely, not because it is easy, but because it is hard, to challenge people to rise to this higher level of creative activity. And that's the way you solve problems. And that's what he meant when he said, these problems are man-made, they can be solved by man and women. And that's our job, to find the people who are not so small that they'll get dragged into the local little fights, but can think in historic terms and universal terms. And that's how you can get a peace for all times.
Okay. Renee.
I just want,
go ahead.
I just want to add to that. The image, of you think about the root of the British royal family. Helga's been urging people to keep looking at that picture of Charles and whatever her name is. I always forget her name, but the picture where they both look so completely miserable, and to laugh at them. But what you're really dealing with is a political center of world events, which was born in the most brutal kind of bloodshed, where they were just ripping each other to shreds and killing each other, and it's never gone away. So why should people respect that? Why should people even give it an ounce of credibility? Why don't people just say, we're not interested in institutions that work that way? It's the failure and the inability to stretch your imagination, stretch your mind to understand that we are all part of a thread of the development of humanity, that we're dependent on the courageous people who created the Renaissance, Nicholas of Cusa, Leonardo da Vinci, but also people like Sir Thomas More, who was a great inspiration in the field of law and the ideas of that there is such a thing as natural law, that law can reflect the way God created the universe. That this is, part of his legacy, and that there are these beautiful ideas out there that we could be identifying with and use to sweep aside the garbage. And people really should join this movement to sweep aside the garbage and to get to these more beautiful ideas.
Jose, if I could just add one more thing.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
One of the things he's known for, and people like Mearsheimer, the so-called realist school, is this idea that you need a balance of power. And this gets to what Renee was just talking about. It's the same thing as Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. There are things that divide us that are unbridgeable. That's the whole view. And therefore, what Kissinger says is you have to get some way of balancing out the interests so that you can have your interest and still allow someone else to have their interest without going to war. But the interests themselves very often are different. And one of the points Mrs. LaRouche has been making is that if the West continues on its present course in being blind or unwilling to accept the idea of the rise of the global South into the global majority, then we'll be setting the stage for the next polarity, which will lead to war. Instead of recognizing that what is it that the global South wants? As Kennedy pointed out in several of his speeches in the Senate, they want what we have. They want freedom. They want prosperity. They want a future. And you can't get a future when you have the green ideology telling you that if you develop your economy, it will take away from someone else. It's a zero-sum game. Or even worse, as Obama told South African students, you can't have an American standard of living because the planet will boil over. That's where you see the immorality inherent in this idea of balance of power, as opposed to the idea of common interests, general welfare. This was the battle cry of the American constitutionalists. We need a government which doesn't represent one interest against the other, but is engaged in promoting the general welfare, the good of all. And that's what's been lost. And that's what's lost in the polarization, the red versus blue, communist versus capitalist, and all these different diversions away from what Kennedy was talking about, which is how you can achieve a peace for all people for all time.
Okay, I'm going to now, unless nobody else has anything else to say, I am going to bring in our special guest. So here we go.
Bam!
Okay, great.
All
right.
Go ahead.
I am the Inquisitor today. And I have a series of questions which are going to be preceded by videos, which we've selected to get your responses. The first is an excerpt from Kennedy's speech on October 22nd, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis speech. And we'll play that excerpt and then we're going to direct this one to you, Harley, and of course, Renee, you can respond to it as well, followed by two other instances of excerpts from different Kennedy moments. So if we can play the first video.
Nevertheless, American citizens have become adjusted to living daily on the bullseye of Soviet missiles located inside the USSR or in submarines. In that sense, missiles in Cuba add to an already clear and present danger. Although it should be noted, the nations of Latin America have never previously been subjected to a potential nuclear threat. But this secret, swift, extraordinary buildup of communist missiles in an area well known to have a special and historical relationship to the United States and the nations of the Western Hemisphere, in violation of Soviet assurances and in defiance of American and hemispheric policy, this sudden, clandestine decision to station strategic weapons for the first time outside of Soviet soil is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo, which cannot be accepted by this country if our courage and our commitments are ever to be trusted again by either friend or foe.
Now, we selected that segment because of the issue as to comparing that situation to that presently of Russia. And Harley, I'd just like to ask you, in hearing that and thinking about what presently exists in terms of the situation in Russia, what your response and your thinking is.
Thank God that Putin is a reasonable leader, because if you substitute the word Cuba or Ukraine for Cuba, you have the same thing Putin had to say that Kennedy said. Can we tolerate the powerful weapons of the nuclear missiles in Cuba? It's that close to the United States. Well, Putin was saying, could we tolerate NATO weapons, missiles, nuclear missiles, within 2 to 5 minutes of Moscow and other Russian cities? And it's the same point. And what we hear from the blind, deaf, and dumb Western leaders is that Putin's response to Ukraine was unprovoked. Well, would you say Kennedy's response to the Cuban Missile Crisis was unprovoked? I mean, this just shows the degree to which the people who run things are either clearly lunatic or assume that no one else is paying any attention to what's going on. And I think that's a very useful thing for people to see. Kennedy was legitimately angry because it was something that was sneaked in. And I can remember the night of that speech. I think I was about 12 or 13 years old, and I remember my father, who was a World War II vet and a Kennedy supporter, coming in and saying to me, "Good night, and I sure hope I'll see you in the morning," because he understood that we may have been on the verge of nuclear war. Now, what saved us at that point was that Kennedy was willing to go and talk to the Russians about mutual security concerns. Why won't the West do that today? And this gets to the whole point of what's this rules-based order. It's an order which will accept no opposition, including from the global South, including from its own population. But as Renee was pointing out, it's an order that, what do they say? It's like AstroTurf, a mile long and an inch deep. It has no real depth to it. It doesn't have support. But the population has not been mobilized in the proper way with a real peace movement, not an anti-war movement, but a real movement based on real security and real development. So I think if people listen to Kennedy once again, maybe you can rethink what's going on in Ukraine from the standpoint of how Kennedy reacted to Soviet missiles being planted in Cuba.
Okay, Renee, you have anything to say about that?
No, it's very clear.
Okay, so we now have a second clip, which is from November 29th, about 1 month later. And this was Kennedy speaking at the occasion of a fundraiser for the National Cultural Center. And it's his view, an excerpt of his view of the role of the artistic principle. We'll play that now.
Thus today, as always, art knows no national boundaries. Genius can speak in any tongue, and the entire world will hear it and listen.
Hear it.
Yeah, hard to hear.
We need a better audio.
Okay, no problem. Let me, let's see what's going on here. I don't know why that's doing that.
Okay.
See if I can fix this here. Let's try this. See if this works. If not, I'll have to get a different version, but let's see. This should work now.
Thus today, as always, art knows no national boundaries. Genius can speak in any tongue, and the entire world will hear it.
Is that any better or worse?
About the same.
That's about the same.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on with this clip today. It's usually getting a problem I've hadn't had before.
That's a problem.
Let me see if I can find another version here.
All right. Well, if you want, then we can go to something else as you find another version of that clip. You have this is out of order, but this one is for both of you to respond to. Now, what this is November 4th, 1963, and this is a private memo that JFK is dictating concerning the the successful coup, but failure in Vietnam, the assassination of Diem. And it's Kennedy making a note about how he regrets having agreed to the coup. And it's about a 4-minute discussion. It's 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks, before he himself will be assassinated. You'll see, I would like to get the response to this as well. So if we can play that.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup, conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon. Opposed to a coup was General Taylor, the Attorney General, Secretary McNamara, to a somewhat less degree, John McCone, partly because of an old hostility to Lodge, which causes him to lack confidence in Lodge's judgment, partly as a result of a new hostility, because Lodge shifted his station chief, semicolon. In favor of the coup was State, led by Abel Harriman, George Ball, Roger Hillsman, supported by Mike Barstow at the White House. I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. Period, in my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. It should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views. While we did redress that balance in later wires, that first wire encouraged Lodge along a course to which he was, in any case, inclined. Hawkins continued to oppose the coup on the ground that the military effort was doing well. There was a sharp split between Saigon and the rest of the country. Politically, the situation was deteriorating. Militarily, it had not had its effect. There was a feeling, however, that it would. For this reason, Secretary McNamara and General Taylor supported applying additional pressures to Zim and Nu in order to move them.
Hello. Naughty, naughty.
Why do the leaves fall? And why does the snow come on the ground?
Because
Why do the leaves turn green? Spring. And where do we go to Cape Ansport? It's summer.
And then what? Your horses.
I was shocked by the death of Zim and Nu. I'd met Zim with Justice Douglas many years ago. He was an extraordinary character, while he became increasingly difficult in the last months. Nevertheless, over a 10-year period, he'd held his country together, maintained its independence under very adverse conditions. The way he was killed made it particularly abhorrent. The question now is whether the generals can stay together and build a stable government, or whether Saigon will turn on public opinion in Saigon, the intellectuals, students, etc., will turn on this government as repressive and undemocratic in the not-too-distant future.
So,
Wow.
so here we're given a very particular insight into a disaster that will now then unfold, inclusive of the Kennedy assassination and inclusive of the history of most of us in Vietnam. But of course, you also have that poignant and tragic interruption by John Kennedy Jr. And then his father returning to the subject after his son leaves the room. So Harley, I'd like you to give us a sort of characterize what this was all about, your own reflections and reactions to what you've just seen.
Well, there's a very excellent discussion of this in the book, JFK and the Unspeakable, which Ray McGovern often refers to. I found it an invaluable book for understanding both the Kennedy assassination, but also the transformation of JFK as a figure. I mean, one of the things that characterized this period, including the June 10th speech, was that he did change. He did change his outlook. He was not stuck in a hardline Cold War view, which his generals like Curtis LeMay and others were stuck. And in dealing with this, Kennedy was moving toward getting U.S. troops overall out of Vietnam, but he was afraid to do that before the election in 1964. And so you had this moment of crisis where there was a push to get a tougher government in power in Vietnam that would be fully supportive of the U.S. effort. The U.S. had so-called advisors there. There were more of them getting killed in this period where this discussion took place. Kennedy was very concerned about what it would mean to see Americans coming back dead from Vietnam. And so he proposed a memo right about this same period of time, be drafted, talking about moving 1,000 troops out by the end of the year, and then all of them out by the end of next year, after the election. And of course, neither of those memos were ever acted on because Kennedy was killed. Now, I don't think you can say he was killed directly because of those memos, but because of the understanding among the types that wanted to keep the Cold War as a policy. And by the way, it's really interesting to me that the State Department was at the center of the group that wanted the coup. A few weeks ago on the Manhattan Project, I went through how the State Department Public Policy Division was the regime change center of the U.S. government. That is, that this was the agency that made the determination of when and where to carry out coups. And the fact that the State Department at that time was pushing for a coup, when some of the military and McNamara was Defense Secretary, General Taylor was Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were opposing it. And I think it gives you some insight into the kind of battles that Kennedy was involved in. And there was a memo written by one of the people who helped write the June 10th speech, Sorensen, who said they had to keep that speech quiet until after he gave it because of the reaction that would occur when he gave that speech. And it reminds me of the reaction when Reagan was about to give the SDI speech on March 23rd, 1983, where he was going to endorse essentially Lyndon LaRouche's approach to the Strategic Defense Initiative to overturn the Kissingerian Strangelove doctrine of mutual and assured destruction. That before Reagan went to give the speech, then top aide to Reagan, James Baker, removed that section from the speech. But right before Reagan gave the speech, Judge Clark, the National Security Advisor, handed him back index cards which had that part of the speech in it. So there are some real fights going on inside the establishment at all times. The problem is that the overwhelming power is in the hands of those people who have their alliances with the international oligarchy, the corporate cartels, especially the banking and financial interests. And so what you can see in that is Kennedy reflecting on what was the right thing to do. And you wish something like that could happen with a Biden or with an Obama or with a Bush, and it doesn't seem to happen. And that's where the littleness and the control comes in.
Renee, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I also think of the JFK book, hearing that, because there's the one by Douglas, because he does such a thorough job on the question of Kennedy's misgivings on this matter of Henry Cabot Lodge. He goes through that in some detail. And I know that that was an important issue for Mr. LaRouche. I mean, in informal settings, Mr. LaRouche had no problem basically naming Henry Cabot Lodge as one of the people who ordered the assassination of John Kennedy. And Douglas goes through some very detailed discussion about how there were other options for making the ambassador to Vietnam, and that and Kennedy and Lodge were known to be bitter opponents of each other. You know, Lodge had actually run against Kennedy, I think, either for the Senate or for the presidential nomination. I'm not sure which one. I can't remember right now. But the point is that there was bad blood between them, and I think it raises some questions about the command structure of this kind of assassination craze, this assassination environment, and that the assassination of DM and the assassination of Kennedy may have been more connected than we think. This is one of the reasons why the documents have to be declassified. It's actually amazing to see how blunt the president is in discussing his fights, his deliberations with the cabinet. You don't hear discussion like that anymore. I'm really shocked. I mean, I didn't realize that he was so open in discussing this, and I think that's a good habit. But it was late, because the question is what was the decision process before that brought Lodge in the middle of all of this.
I think
Henry Cabot Lodge, by the way, was Nixon's vice presidential nominee in 1960. So it was the Nixon Lodge ticket. And as Lynn always pointed out, the lodges and the Cabots, Henry Cabot Lodge, go back to the opium ships in the mid-19th century. And that's right. The Boston Brahmin faction, which was William Weld was the inheritor of that tradition when he was brought in on the Get LaRouche task force.
Yep.
Yes. The final excerpt we'll use, we are not going to use the one that we were having the problems with, but we found something that will more than fit the bill. October 26, 1963, JFK at Amherst College, speaking in memoriam at that point to the poet Robert Frost, who'd been a very close friend of his and actually had been involved on Kennedy's behalf in discussions with the Soviet Union, a kind of back channel of the Soviet Union. And we want to get your responses, starting with you, Renee, to this particular clip.
Just confirming here, Dennis, this is a 14-minute clip?
No, it's not. It's the one that should be the excerpt, not the full speech. You don't have the excerpt?
The excerpt is 14 minutes.
No, it's not that one. It's not that one. Well, we're trying to substitute. I mean, if you have if you could use the other one, great. I was just trying to get
I think I can, actually. We can try this again.
Try it. Okay, try it again. Let's see.
Okay. Here we go.
Thus today, as always, art.
Nope, that didn't work. Try.
Dennis, I could say something on Kennedy and Robert Frost that might be of interest.
Why don't you do that? And while you're doing that, we'll try to get this cued.
Yeah.
Why don't you? That's good.
You know, people don't understand Frost, or they don't understand poetry generally. And LaRouche talked about the importance of poetry as a medium of metaphor. And that is that you can say things without saying them by creating images that cause people to have to be provoked into thinking. And there's this one poem of Frost's, which I hear cited very often by
Knows no national boundaries.
by conservatives who want to assert that Frost and Kennedy would have been for a wall on the southern border. And that's Frost's poem, which has as its line, "Good fences make good neighbors." And if you read the poem, you can't help getting the point that what Frost is saying is that good fences don't make good neighbors, that actually talking and working with people is what makes good neighbors. And this was the central theme of Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, his outreach to Mexico and Latin America generally. And I think, again, it's important to realize that this question of art causes people to think on a different level, as opposed to a literal level, as opposed to just connecting the dots, but actually developing hypotheses that go outside of what is in the words themselves. And Frost was quite good at that. There are many poems that you could think of for that, but I'm not surprised that Kennedy, who had a very good sense of humor, if you listen to his press conferences, very good sense of humor. And I'm not surprised that Kennedy and Frost had a mutual admiration.
Yeah, thanks. Also, I got an email, text message, Jose, that the national culture speech is clear online. I don't know what that means. If they mean that they are hearing your excerpt online clearly.
Yes, on YouTube not. They hear it clearly. It's just you guys here who can't hear it clearly.
I see. Well, that's not good since they have to respond to it. But that's good to know that people at least can hear it. So I guess the question is, if you can get us a halfway clear audio on our side, we'll let the YouTube audience enjoy the clip. Let's go with that. Okay.
I said, okay, yep, we're gonna try it here.
Great.
Thus today, as always, art knows no national boundaries. Genius can speak in any tongue, and the entire world will hear it and listen. Behind the storm of daily conflict and crisis, the dramatic confrontations, the tumult of political struggle, the poet, the artist, the musician, continues the quiet work of centuries, building bridges of experience between peoples, reminding man of the universality of his feelings and desires and despairs, and reminding him that the forces that unite are deeper than those that divide. Thus art, and the encouragement of art, is political in the most profound sense, not as a weapon in the struggle, but as an instrument of understanding of the futility of struggle between those who share man's fate. Aeschylus and Plato are remembered today, long after the triumphs of imperial Athens are gone. Dante outlived the ambitions of 13th century Florence. Goethe stands serenely above the politics of Germany. And I am certain that after the dust of centuries has passed over our cities, we too will be remembered, not for victories or defeats in battle or in politics, but for our contribution to the human spirit.
So, Renee, I'd like you to respond to that, and then we'll go to Harley.
Well, of course, it makes me think of how much the intelligence agencies were involved in this attack on Furtwängler coming out of Germany, you know, and Alan Dulles' role in this and the founding of the CCF, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. I mean, they really were freaked out about the fact that people were responsive to great cultural inputs and to science and so forth. And there were terrible things that were done during this period. You know, when I talked about Fritz Kramer finding Henry Kissinger in the garbage can in 1943, it makes me think of how prior to that, when the war was not predetermined how it was going to turn out, you know, that you had Alan Dulles stationed there in Switzerland, the brother of John Foster Dulles, who then became Secretary of State and was part of this war policy. And they were completely fixated on what was going on with the German musical community and with the scientific community, completely fixated, and playing all kinds of games because these people were supporters of the idea that Hitler should be assassinated, that Hitler should be removed, that there should be a coup against Hitler. They were actually trying to organize a coup against Hitler. And as is known, there were 13 assassination attempts against Hitler that was supported even by clergymen like Bonhoeffer. And they all failed. Why did they fail? Because Alan Dulles was positioned to spill the beans on what they were doing, and they kept funneling the information to the Gestapo, and these people would get you know, arrested and so forth. So I mean, you have these games that are going on, and a lot of it is driven by the panic, you know, in the degeneracy in these layers is so great that are involved in this kind of covert activity, that they'll really stop at nothing, and which is the reason that the danger of nuclear war is so great, because they really don't have the situation under control, and people should get on the stick, and we should unleash the culture that they're so afraid of in all of its different manifestations, and this Russophobia, and as a method of organizing society, completely end that, and also at the same time promote, you know, a real renaissance of scientific and cultural activity.
Harley?
Well, when I listened to that excerpt, I was thinking of Shelley's poem Ozymandias, which I'll try to recite a part of it. I may not get it across, but the thing that stands out is as he's describing a traveler who came back from a desert and saw these trunkless legs of stone standing in the desert, and there was a shattered visage lying in the sand next to it, and there was a sneer of cold command on those lips, and then on the pedestal it says, as you get this picture of a statue of someone who thought he was important, just shattered and lying there in the sand, the words appear, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." And then Shelley ends it by saying, "Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." You know, this idea that you have this arrogance. There's an interesting article by Patrick Lancaster in the, I think it's, he's basically writing about, are they blind and deaf or just stupid? The arrogance toward the global South that was expressed in Kissinger's comment is the same as that statue in the Shelley poem. arrogance toward the world in the sense of being the greatest powers of the universe, when in fact there's a revolution underway, there's something new occurring. And that's what Kennedy was talking about with Africa in 1959. There's a revolution, there's a change. And they tried to kill it by killing Lumumba, by destroying the attempts for peace in the Congo, the assassination of Sadat, the Gaddafi, over and over and over. And yet Africa is emerging today as a power because it's a country, it's a continent of human beings. And this is what we should take as our mission, to nourish these other countries and to share the hopes and dreams of the future. And the fact that there are space programs in countries in Africa, while we've been satisfied with 40 years, more than 40 years since the last moon mission. So, I think this fight against arrogance, one of the greatest weapons we have is classical culture and poetry. And though I didn't do a good job with it, I would really encourage people to read Shelley's poem, Ozymandias, to get a sense of where in the future, or what in the future people think of people like Tony Blinken and Ursula von der Leyen and Annalena Baerbock.
So we've covered today a century of the putrescence known as Henry Kissinger. We've also covered something more than that, which is the hope for a new world. And certainly that's a world that Lyndon LaRouche devoted his life, his mission, and his organization's life and mission to. And in thinking about the American presidency and just thinking about the role that on the one hand Henry Kissinger played, on the other hand Lyndon LaRouche played, and looking at where we are now, I think the final question I'd just like to ask, and this is sort of a way of getting also summary thoughts, is we're coming to this anniversary, 60th anniversary of the American University speech. Everybody heard it at the beginning of this program. But we also are coming at this from the standpoint of current history. We are looking at this as from the standpoint of classical tragedy, yes. We're also looking at it from the standpoint of doing something about it. And so I'd like to ask, Harley, let's go to you first and then go to Renee. Given this new challenge that we will be posing to people, not new in the sense that it's literally new, but new in the sense that we're talking about going to a kind of different level of commitment on the part of the individual citizen. And Lynn spoke to that in his piece, Politics is Art. Are there any recommendations you want to make for what people might do? You also just referenced Shelley as poetry, but politically speaking, in the next days and weeks, what are your recommendations for what people should do and how they should take up this challenge?
I think the most important thing we've been discussing is that you have to have an optimistic view which radiates from yourself. Now, in my discussion with Helga this week, she made an important point, which is the role of love and love of mankind that should be the driving instinct that moves us. That we're not, as evil as Kissinger is, we're not trying to win this fight because we hate Kissinger, but because we love the potential in every child born on this planet. And we cherish those children, as Kennedy said, and we wish to give them an opportunity to develop their creative potentials to improve conditions for all of mankind for now and into the future, and also as a way that we can pay back those who went before us. And so it's this question of love, acting with love. Now, if you do that, and if you can be creative with it, then that's how you can win this fight. I mean, it's just so many people who listen to that Kennedy speech say they were blown away to hear a president speak that way. Well, why didn't you know about it? It's because it's been kept from you. You've been deprived of your own history. Why is it that we are being told that in Ukraine, they're saying that no one should ever listen to Tchaikovsky or read Pushkin because they're Russians? And yet the same culture that says that is the woke culture, which says you should allow anything. Well, these contradictions should be used to show people how they're being manipulated and used. And that in fact, if they use their own creative powers, they can come up with ways of doing something. There just was another example of an intervention, like the ones that Jose has done. I guess it was against Rachel Maddow by Max Blumenthal. Everybody has an opportunity to stand up and tell the truth and to show other people in an audience that we're not going to be silent. And that's what it means to be a loving human being, to love the truth and want to spread the truth so other people can be enlightened by it and given the courage to stand up and do what's right.
Renee?
Well, I think that there needs to be a lot of discussion, that people have to realize that simply even calling a relative or a friend or that person, everybody I talk to says, there's this person I've been thinking for years I should get them involved in what you're doing, and they hesitate and they hesitate. The people have to stop hesitating, and they've got to work out that list, and they've got to start unleashing themselves to talk to people about these real things. There's a beautiful reference in the Politics is Art section where Lynn just says in passing that in great theater, the audience is triggered to discover their imagination and the difference between imagination and illusion. I think that's very important because we live because there's so much money being pumped into entertainment forms which heighten illusion, deception, and the people should learn the difference, and the difference is a moral one. What are the ideas? What are the necessary concepts? What are the activities that will enable us to assemble in such a way that we really do bring people together to become government of, by, and for the people? What do we have to do? And it starts with people just talking to others about these questions and who Lynn is and why this fight is going on, and that we're at a punctum saliens. We were at a punctum saliens when Kennedy was elected, or in that decade, this problem really should have been solved after World War II, and it wasn't. And this is our last chance. I mean, 1989 was another visitation when the Berlin Wall came down, but we know what happened then. The enemy was too strong. But now they're not strong anymore. They're weak because of what the third world countries have done. And it's time for people to just talk to everybody and to get into the habit of discussing these important things and finding out that you can move another person's soul. And I think because we got to get thousands of people involved in this, thousands of people, and people should just cut it and stop pretending that that they're too afraid, intimidated to talk about these matters. They've got to get into it.
Renee Segerson, Harley Schlanger, thanks for being with us today and doing what you've done. What we're going to do now is play something which indicates the character of change that President Kennedy represented. And it's important because with what Renee just said, it's exactly the character of change that we're interested in and have to be interested in the American people. We are not going to find, you will never find, in fact, a perfect leader that is going to meet the expectations that you have, because often your expectations will be wrong. And that leader may be right, but by violating your expectations may be seen as negative, a figure that you denounce, even as he or she takes the world forward. Or it may be someone with whom you completely agree, who may, in the course of their implementing what they themselves believe in, fall down or be manipulated or be misdirected. And this is precisely why the founders of the nation insisted that there had to be a republic, a group of people whose responsibility was not merely a personal one, though they took it personally, but which was codified in the Declaration of Independence and also in the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, so that there was an idea that was made concrete and was made, if you will, legal in this best sense of that term, a declaration that the law of deliberation was the law of self-government. So what we're going to do here is show you two excerpts of Kennedy's discussions about space. And of course, after all, the space program, the landing of man on the moon, is very identified with Kennedy. But we're going to show you a transformation that occurred this between November of 1962 and September of 1963. The first is an excerpt that would be less than a month after the Cuban Missile Crisis speech, which we showed a short excerpt from before, then followed by a speech that he gave at the United Nations. And we will show these back to back. And you will immediately be provoked by the obvious, if you will, contradiction between them. And then we'll attempt to talk about the coincidence of opposites that actually links these two statements, which are themselves mutually exclusive, apparently.
You put this program, I think this program is the top priority program of the agency?
No, sir, I do not. I think it is one of the top priority programs, but I think it's very important to recognize here that as you had found what you could do with the rocket, as you found how you could get out beyond the Earth's atmosphere and into space and make measurements, several scientific disciplines that are very powerful have begun to converge on this area.
Jim, I think it is the top priority. I think we ought to have that very clear. Some of these other programs can slip 6 months or 9 months and nothing particularly is going to happen. But this is important for political reasons, international political reasons, and for this is, whether we like it or not, in a sense, a race. If we get second to the moon, it's nice, but it's like being second anytime. So that and if we're second by 6 months, because we didn't give it the kind of priority, then of course that'd be very serious. So I think we have to take the view this is the top priority.
Number one, there are real unknowns as to whether man can live under the weightless condition and you will ever make the lunar landing. This is one kind of political vulnerability I'd like to avoid such a flat commitment to.
I agree that we're interested in, but we can wait 6 months.
But you have to use that information to do your thing.
Yeah, but only when that information directly applies to the program. Jim, I think we got to have that.
Mr. President, we don't know a damn thing about the surface of the moon, and we're making the wildest guesses about how we're going to land on the moon. And we could get a terrible disaster from putting something down on the surface of the moon that's very different than we think it is. And the scientific programs that find us that information have to have the highest priority, but they are associated with a lunar program. The scientific programs that aren't associated with a lunar program can have any priority we please to give them.
Well, the other thing is, I would certainly not favor spending $6 to $7 billion to find out about space. Why are we spending $7 billion in getting fresh water from salt water when we're spending $7 billion to find out about space? But so obviously you wouldn't put it on that priority except for the defense implications. And the second point is the fact that the Soviet Union has made this a test of the system. So that's why we're doing it. So I think we've got to take the view that this is the key program, and the rest of it, we can find out about it, but there's a lot of things we want to find out about.
But you see,
cancer and everything else.
When you talk about this, it's very hard to draw a line between what
I think everything that we do ought to really be tied into getting onto the moon and ahead of the Russians.
Why can't it be tied to preeminence in space, which are your own words?
Because, by God, we've been telling everybody we're preeminent in space. For 5 years, nobody believes it because they have the booster and the satellite. But I do think we ought to get it, really clear that the policy ought to be that this is the top priority program of the agency, and one of the two, except for defense, the top priority of the United States government. I think that's the position we ought to take. Now, this may not change anything about that schedule, but at least we ought to be clear. Otherwise, we shouldn't be spending this kind of money because I'm not that interested in space. I think it's good. I think we ought to know about it. We're ready to spend reasonable amounts of money, but we're talking about
fantastic expenditures which wreck our budget, and all these other domestic programs, and the only justification for it, in my opinion, to do it is because we hope to beat them and demonstrate that starting behind as we did by a couple of years, by God, we passed them.
For propaganda purposes. Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity, in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declared that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon, not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries.
Now, that outlook would not occur again in the United States after the assassination of JFK until March 23rd, 1983, when President Ronald Reagan would propose precisely that kind of cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union in the form of the Strategic Defense Initiative Program, an initiative that was created by Lyndon LaRouche precisely in opposition to the ideas of Henry Kissinger's nuclear weapons and foreign policy, which had been published in the late 1950s. And it was because of the campaign that Lyndon LaRouche was doing, which had begun much earlier than 1983, that Kissinger and others were such visceral opponents of Lyndon LaRouche and his outlook, other than their own sense that they and not the people of the global South should dominate the world. But what happened to Kennedy? I mean, he clearly in November of 62, he's saying one thing, and September of 63, it seems to be precisely the opposite. What happened is that there's a process of change, of deliberation. It existed on many things and in many ways. That had to do with the nature of the American presidential system and the nature of the intervention into the American presidential system, which was in fact accessible to the individual citizens of the United States. Martin Luther King approached that, accessed that relationship to the presidency, and Lyndon LaRouche accessed that relationship to the presidencies, but despite the fact that they were private citizens. And so next week, when we will convene a conference of the Schiller Institute, will be convened, I should say, and it will be commemorating this, we invite you and thousands or tens of thousands of others to join in reflecting upon that moment of change, of transformation that the President of the United States led because he was capable of changing his outlook, changing an axiomatic position, but it was the same person. That's not a weakness, that's a strength. And it's precisely that strength and that idea of change which is essential to the conduct of the American presidency. It was in the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. It was in the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. It was in the presidency of John F. Kennedy. And it has to be that which we return as a capacity to the American people. And that is a willful decision of each of us. And we invite you to joint with us in making that decision on behalf of the American people. So next week in this, in the time period, actually earlier, 10 a.m. in the morning, a Schiller Institute conference will convene, and we will commemorate the intent and the words of President John F. Kennedy, and we invite that everybody be involved with us in that mission. So on behalf of everyone who joined us today for the Manhattan meeting, we want to thank you all and invite you to, in the spirit of what has been said by President Kennedy here, be as big as you wish. There are no problems that mankind has created that mankind cannot solve, but it does require a unity of purpose and a unity of voice to do so.